By sundown, 100 men had circled a single fence line. One man stood inside it, alone, a rifle in his hands and a girl behind his back. He had buried his badge 3 years before. He had sworn never to raise a gun again, but some promises break the moment someone threatens a child who cannot even scream for help. Before that sun fully set, the whole valley would learn what one broken ranger was willing to risk for a girl who had lost her voice, and never once her courage. The Larkspur Valley belonged to one man before it belonged to anyone else. Colonel Amos Draven owned the bank, the mill, and most of the sheriff's silence. His cattle grazed on land he never bought, only claimed, and no rancher dared draw a fence without his permission. Draven ruled the valley the way a storm rules a prairie, arriving whenever it pleased, and leaving nothing untouched behind it. Small ranchers learned to bow their heads when his riders passed. Merchants learned to extend him credit whether they wished to or not. Even the church bell seemed to ring softer on Sundays, as though faith itself hesitated to challenge a man with that much land and that much fear at his command. Justice in Larkspur wore Draven's boots more often than it wore the sheriff's badge. Jonah Reeves' ranch sat at the valley's edge, small and stubborn, the last patch of dirt Draven had never managed to swallow. Jonah kept to himself. He fixed fences, fed his few cattle, and spoke to almost no one since he turned in his ranger's badge. He traded in the frontier once for something quieter, a modest homestead, a herd small enough to manage alone, a life built entirely around silence, the way other men built lives around family or fortune. The valley whispered many reasons for his silence. Some said he had killed a man in cold blood and fled west to escape a hanging. Others said Draven himself had broken him years before and left him too afraid to fight back. The rumors changed with every saloon conversation, each one wilder and less true than the last. None of them knew the real one, buried the same year he quit. The valley itself stretched wide beneath a sky that rarely offered shade. Cattle trails cut through dry grass toward the river, the only water for miles that Draven had not yet found a way to claim. Wagons passed through twice a month, carrying supplies and strangers who rarely stayed long enough to understand the quiet rules that governed Larkspur. The general store doubled as the valley's courthouse of gossip. Farmers traded seed and rumor in equal measure, and by the time a story reached the far end of the valley, it barely resembled the truth it had started as. Trust was a rare currency in Larkspur, spent carefully and rarely offered to strangers. The old church at the crossroads held services every Sunday, though few believed faith carried much weight against a man who owned the bank and the sheriff both. Hope survived anyway, stubborn as the grass that grew back each spring despite Draven's cattle grazing it flat every season. Jonah Reeve had once ridden with the finest company of Texas Rangers in the territory. He was fast, disciplined, and trusted with the hardest assignments. Outlaws feared his name before they ever saw his face. Fellow Rangers called him the steadiest hand in 3 counties, a man who never once hesitated when trouble arrived. Then came the raid at Miller's Crossing, where he arrived 4 minutes too late to save a family from men far worse than outlaws. 4 minutes! He had counted them 1,000 times since, turning the number over like a stone worn smooth from handling. He carried that failure like a stone in his chest, heavier every year. He remembered every detail of that ride. The dust, the gunfire echoing across the ridge, the silence that followed when he finally reached the homestead. Silence had never sounded the same to him again. He left the Rangers within a month. He turned in his badge without explanation, ignoring every officer who tried to talk him out of it. He bought a ranch nobody wanted, on land nobody else would fight for, and told himself silence was penance enough. For 3 years, it almost was. He built his fences alone. He mended his own boots, cooked his own meals, and spoke to his cattle more often than he spoke to any living person. The town considered him a ghost who happened to still draw breath, and Jonah did nothing to correct that impression. Then, one autumn morning, smoke rose from the Hargrove homestead 6 miles north, and Jonah rode toward it before his mind caught up with his hands. Some instincts, it turned out, never fully retired. The girl's name was Ruth, though she had not spoken it herself in weeks. Jonah found her hiding beneath a collapsed porch, soot on her face, her family already gone. She did not scream, she did not cry. She simply stared at him with eyes that had watched something no child should ever witness. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her small hands were blistered from clawing through debris that used to be her home. She held nothing except a scrap of burlap clutched so tightly her fingertips had turned white. The doctor in town called it shock. The old women called it a curse. Jonah called it silence, the same silence he carried himself, and he understood it better than any doctor could. He recognized something familiar in her stillness, a mirror held up to his own 3 years of quiet grief. He had learned long ago that some pain simply refused to fit inside spoken words. Ruth had seen the men who killed her family. She had seen their faces clearly enough to hang every one of them. That made her the only witness left alive against Colonel Draven's hired guns. That also made her a target no fence could fully protect. The town wanted to send her to an orphanage 2 counties over, far from Larkspur, far from any danger her silence still carried. Jonah refused before anyone finished the sentence. He had already failed to arrive in time once. He would not fail this child by handing her to strangers who might not even believe her drawings mattered. The town council argued for a full afternoon before Jonah simply walked out, Ruth's small hand in his, ending the debate without a single raised voice. Some decisions he had learned long ago needed no permission from anyone else. Ruth's aunt, the only living relative anyone could locate, sent a single letter refusing custody, citing distance and hardship in a handwriting too neat for genuine grief. Jonah read the letter once, folded it away, and never mentioned it to Ruth at all. Some truths, he decided, could wait until she was older and stronger. Jonah carried Ruth back to his ranch because no other choice felt bearable. She did not speak during the ride. She gripped his coat sleeve the entire way, small knuckles pale from holding on so tightly. The horse moved slow and steady beneath them, careful not to jostle the fragile bundle riding in front of the saddle. Dust rose behind them the whole way home, the same red dust that coated every road in the valley. Jonah kept one hand steady on the reins and one arm wrapped protectively around the girl, saying nothing, letting the rhythm of hooves fill the silence between them. When they reached the ranch, she refused to let go even after he set her down by the fire. He built the flames higher than necessary, hoping warmth might do what words could not. "You're safe here," Jonah told her, kneeling to her height. "Nobody gets past that fence without going through me first." Ruth studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lie grown men usually hid behind kind words. She found none. For the first time since the fire, her shoulders loosened just slightly, and she allowed herself to sit down beside him instead of behind him. She reached out, hesitant, and touched the edge of his old ranger badge, half buried in a drawer he had never fully closed the door on. Jonah did not explain the badge that night. He simply let her hold it, small fingers tracing the worn star, until her breathing slowed into something close to sleep. Weeks passed, and Ruth built her own language out of silence. She learned to tap the table twice for yes, once for no. Jonah learned to watch her hands the way he once watched a trail for tracks, patient and attentive, never rushing her toward words she was not ready to give. She drew pictures instead of speaking, small sketches of the ranch, the horses, and once, quietly, a hidden drawing of 4 riders she never showed to anyone but Jonah. He kept that drawing folded inside his coat, close to his chest, a piece of evidence he prayed he would never need. Jonah built a small fence around the garden just for her, low enough that she could tend it herself. He measured the boards twice before cutting them, wanting the fence sturdy enough to outlast any storm the valley might send its way. The day her tomatoes ripened, she smiled for the first time since the fire, and Jonah felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed for 3 years. He said nothing about the smile. He simply sat beside her in the dirt, sharing the first tomato of the season like it was a feast fit for kings. She began leaving small carvings on his porch rail, whittled from scrap wood using a knife he had taught her to handle safely. A horse, a star. Once, a small rifle which made Jonah pause longer than he expected before setting it gently on the shelf beside her other gifts. One evening, thunder rolled across the valley, and Ruth crawled into his lap without a word, trembling, trusting him more than she trusted the storm. Rain hammered the roof above them, and Jonah held perfectly still, afraid one wrong movement might undo months of careful, wordless trust. Jonah held her until the thunder passed, silently promising himself he would never let anyone take that trust from her again. By harvest season, she had started humming quietly while she worked the garden, small, broken tunes with no words attached. Jonah considered that humming the loudest sound he had heard in years. She began accompanying him on short rides along the fence line, perched carefully in front of the saddle, watching him check each post and wire with the same discipline he once brought to ranger patrols. She learned the names of every cow on the ranch faster than Jonah expected, tapping his arm twice whenever she spotted one wandering too close to the tree line. One afternoon, a traveling peddler stopped at the ranch, startling Ruth badly enough that she hid behind the woodpile until he left. Jonah noticed, said nothing critical, and simply built a small warning bell near the gate so she would always hear visitors approaching well before they arrived. Small comforts, he had learned, mattered more than grand gestures when it came to rebuilding trust. By late autumn, Ruth had taught herself to write a handful of words in charcoal on scrapboards, spelling out simple things first: horse, home, safe. Jonah kept every board she filled, stacking them carefully in the barn like a library of her slow, determined healing. Word of Ruth's survival eventually reached Colonel Draven, carried by a careless deputy who mentioned the girl who lived. Draven understood the danger immediately. A living witness meant a hanging judge someday, and a hanging judge meant the end of everything he had built through fear. He had spent a decade constructing an empire on rumor and intimidation, and one small girl's memory threatened to topple it in a single afternoon in court. He rode to Jonah's ranch himself, flanked by 2 men, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Hand over the girl, Reeve," Draven said. "She's not safe with a broken ranger playing farmer." "She's safer with me than she'd ever be with you," Jonah answered. Draven's smile thinned. "Then you understand what happens next." He turned his horse without another word, leaving behind only dust and a threat neither man needed to speak aloud again. Jonah watched him ride toward the ridge, already calculating how many days of peace remained before the valley changed for good. 3 days later, riders began gathering on the ridge above the valley, more arriving with each sunrise, until the count reached far past anything one rancher could survive alone. Some rode in from neighboring counties, drawn by Draven's money rather than any loyalty to his cause. Others were local men who owed him debts too large to refuse. Whatever their reasons, their rifles pointed the same direction, and their numbers grew heavier every hour. Townsfolk in Larkspur locked their doors early that week. The saloon emptied faster than usual each night. Even the sheriff, a man who preferred naps to conflict, found himself pacing his office long after dark, weighing loyalty against the fear that had kept his badge quiet for years. By the 4th morning, 100 men surrounded Jonah's fence line, waiting only for Draven's signal. Ruth watched the riders gather from the loft window, small hands pressed against the glass, saying nothing, understanding everything. Neighboring ranchers sent word offering shelter, though few offered to stand and fight alongside him. Most understood Draven's reach too well to risk it, their own families and herds too vulnerable to gamble against a man with 100 riders at his call. Jonah did not blame them. He simply thanked each messenger and sent them home before dark. One rancher, an old friend from his ranger days, rode out anyway against his own better judgment, bringing extra ammunition and a single promise. "I can't stay past tonight," he told Jonah, "but I won't let you face tomorrow morning with an empty rifle." Jonah accepted the gift without argument, grateful for even one hand willing to risk Draven's fury. By the 3rd night, Jonah had barely slept, mapping every angle of approach 100 riders might use against a single fence line. He moved wagons into place, strung ropes low across the yard, and taught Ruth exactly where to hide the moment trouble arrived. She listened to every instruction without flinching, tapping the table twice each time to show she understood. Jonah could have handed Ruth over that morning and lived to see another sunset. He considered it, if only for a heartbeat, staring at the small girl clutching her drawing behind him. Then he remembered Miller's Crossing, the 4 minutes that haunted him, the family he arrived too late to save. He would not be 4 minutes too late again. "If they take you," he told Ruth quietly, They'll make sure you never speak the truth to anyone. I won't let that happen. Not this time." Ruth tapped the table once, then twice, an answer only he understood. "No. Yes. Don't give up. Stay." Jonah knelt beside her, matching her stillness with his own, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Outside, the distant sound of horses shifting on the ridge carried through the thin walls of the ranch house. He thought of every reason surrender might seem wise. His life, hers, the quiet peace he had built over 3 careful years. None of those reasons outweighed the look in her eyes when she tapped that table twice. Jonah loaded his rifle, checked the fence line, and chose to stand exactly where he was. He spent that final night preparing every inch of the property, driving stakes, tightening ropes, and rehearsing a plan built from years of ranger training he had sworn never to use again. Some promises, he realized, existed to be broken for the right reasons. He checked on Ruth twice before dawn, finding her awake both times, sitting upright with her drawing pressed against her knees. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Fear filled the small room, but so did something steadier, something closer to faith than either had felt in years. Draven's voice carried across the valley at dawn. "Last chance, Reeve. Open the gate." "Come and open it yourself," Jonah called back. The first riders advanced, and Jonah fired a warning shot that dropped a hat, not a man, buying seconds he desperately needed. He had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing the narrow approach to his gate, forcing any charge into a single choke point between 2 collapsed wagons. Dust exploded around the hooves of advancing horses. Shouts rose from the ridge, some hesitant, some eager, none of them certain how the morning would end. Jonah kept his rifle steady, counting seconds the way he once counted rangers at his back, though this time he stood entirely alone. Ruth, hidden in the root cellar as instructed, clutched her drawing of the 4 riders, and for the first time in months, found her voice. She screamed, not from fear, from memory. The scream carried across the yard just as the town sheriff arrived, drawn by 3 days of rumors he could no longer ignore, trailing 6 deputized townsmen who had finally found their courage. The sheriff's arrival scattered confusion through Draven's ranks. Riders exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether they had signed on for a range war or a reckoning neither Draven nor his money could talk them out of. The sheriff saw Ruth's drawing pressed against the cellar door, 4 faces sketched with a child's precision, faces that matched 3 of Draven's riders exactly. He held the drawing high enough for the whole yard to see it, evidence more damning than any courtroom testimony the valley had witnessed in years. Draven's men hesitated at the sight of the badge and the crowd of witnesses now gathering along the ridge. "She saw you," the sheriff said slowly, staring at Draven. "She saw all of you." The silence that followed was louder than any gunfire. One by one, the hired guns lowered their rifles, unwilling to hang for a man who would abandon them the moment the truth came out. Horses shifted uneasily as their riders backed away from the fence line, choosing self-preservation over loyalty bought with fear. Draven reached for his own weapon, one final desperate motion, but the sheriff's deputies closed the distance before his hand ever found the grip. His empire, built across a decade of silence and threats, collapsed inside the span of a single morning. Jonah lowered his rifle only after the last rider abandoned the ridge, dust settling slowly over a yard that minutes before had promised nothing but bloodshed. He crossed to the root cellar himself, pulling the door open with hands that finally allowed themselves to shake. Ruth climbed out into the morning light, drawing still clutched to her chest, eyes searching his face for confirmation that the danger had truly passed. Jonah knelt, nodded once, and for the first time since Miller's crossing, felt the stone in his chest ease its grip, if only slightly. The sheriff shook Jonah's hand before riding back toward town with Draven in irons, promising a trial that the whole valley would remember for years. Townsfolk who had watched from a cautious distance slowly approached the fence line, offering water, blankets, and the kind of quiet respect Jonah had not felt directed at him since his ranger days. Colonel Draven was arrested within the hour, his empire collapsing as fast as it had risen. His trial drew crowds from 3 counties, all eager to hear the testimony of the small girl who had refused to stay silent when it mattered most. Ruth spoke fully within the month, her sentences short at first, then longer, then finally filled with the same stubborn courage Jonah had seen in her from the very first day. Her testimony, delivered in a small, clear voice, finished what her drawings had already started. The valley that once feared her silence now thanked her voice, the same voice that had convicted the men who thought a child could never testify against them. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid her now brought bread to the ranch, the same clumsy apologies frontier towns always seemed to offer once the truth finally surfaced. Jonah rebuilt the fence around the garden, wider this time, strong enough for a real home instead of just a shelter. He no longer built with penance in mind. He built with hope, plank by plank, the way a man builds something meant to last generations rather than simply survive one more season. Ruth planted tomatoes every spring after that, and every harvest, she left the first ripe one on the porch beside him without a word. Some promises never needed speaking at all. Jonah's badge stayed in its drawer, but he no longer thought of it as something buried. It became, instead, a reminder that courage sometimes wears the shape of an old fence line, a rifle held steady, and a silent girl brave enough to trust one broken man with everything she had left. Years later, travelers passing through Larkspur Valley still heard the story told the same way. 100 men once surrounded a single ranch, and one quiet ranger, standing for a mute girl nobody else believed, proved that justice and love could still outlast even the deepest fear the frontier had to offer. Ruth grew up on that same ranch, tending the same garden fence Jonah had built for her, teaching her own children the value of patience, silence, and the kind of courage that does not always need a loud voice to matter. She kept her childhood drawings in a small wooden box, showing them only to those she trusted enough to understand what silence once cost her family. Jonah never returned to the Rangers, though the territory offered him a badge more than once in the years that followed. He always declined the same way, gesturing toward the ranch, the fence, and the woman Ruth had become. "I already found the assignment worth staying for," he told them, and no one who knew the story ever doubted him again. The end.